Distinguished colleagues, so we listen to Vyacheslav's presentation. Well, definitely, this is very academic presentation, and this is very big value. So thank you very much. Please provide your questions, comments, remarks to the chat. So we are almost exactly on time, and we have to admit that all the speakers sticking to timing, and that's very good. That's really great. And now we are coming to the next presentation, ethical aspects of the real world studies. And this is Professor Khokhlov, who is the lead of Yaroslavl Medical University Chair and Chief Clinical Pharmacologist of Yaroslavl Region and Central Federal Region, Professor, corresponding member of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Professor Khokhlov, the floor is yours. You are welcome. Everything that is related to the ethical issues in the real-world studies, that's becoming very relevant due to the events ongoing in the country and in the world. You clearly remember that's a very bulky definition of bioethics. Bioethics is a science of survival that includes not only humanity with total changes, it includes the whole alive world. And today, when we are in this very bulky definition on the COVID circumstances, we can appreciate responses to the multiple questions. Yes, ecology is changing our life, and we are a part of biosphere that causes multiple changes in our life. So there are new challenges now related to new infections and coronavirus infections. Also, Ebola was recently. So we have to understand that there are many things, but we have to react to that, and ethics means a lot. Under COVID, the special place is given to the minor interventional studies using the principles of good clinical practice, GCP, according to the protocol of the study. This is law 441, and we know this law very well. We use it actively in the practice. Definitely here, there are not just medical challenges, but as we said, legal challenges, ethical challenges, bioethical challenges. And I have to say that and it was reflected in the last journals of medical access, which is currently in press. I think within 1 month it will appear and will be available on the website. So the ethical expertise and the real clinical practice according to the tasks which are set by now. This is definitely ethical expertise of the projects in the real world projects, real world studies, which are formulated in the Helsinki Declaration by the World Medical Association. These are rules of GCP, good clinical practice, then EEU, practice of the pharmacovigilance, then recommendations of the ethical committees, recommendations of WHO, and the Law 61, with the particular amendments and appendixes, but it covers just the clinical interventional studies. So non-interventional are not included. And as a result of that, the big role of the ethical expertise from these studies, mainly local ethical committees. That is why, in order to provide correct ethical expertise, we should make the following algorithm. We have to identify the proper type of the study, where it's interventional or non-interventional. We have to be sure that the targets of the study are clearly scientific and clearness of presenting information, clearness for the patient, for the HCPs, and also measures of protection, personal patient's data. And the last one, personal data protection, is very important. have to assess the procedure of getting informed consent form, which should be checked and double checked. So this is a bit different situation. We have to pay attention to the personal data protection. So informed consent form in the current legal requirements and ethical committees, we have to identify that the burden to the patient is not higher than minimally available. So registrational charts, surveys, etc. So the quality of the studies are the key ones to get clear results. Okay, it should be very clearly presented in a number of patients. It's not just the administration of the drug and procedures. So we know the drugs, we know the volumes. So it does not exclude that there are some additional data. But the first is the attention to the personal data, the use, the storage, the anonymous information, the terms of data storage, how many persons could get access to the primary source data, to the patient's records forms. So real practice data, actually, it includes all these specificities. Besides, information patient brochure. Here we have to pay attention to give the right of the patients for the personal data protection.
And of course, issues related to processing the primary documentation, issues related to informed consent. The patient should know all his rights because that's not just ethics, it's much more. Unfortunately, researchers do not pay attention to that right now. The patient also has the right to recall the informed consent if we cannot depersonalize the data fully. The patient should be informed about that because it can have an impact on the patient's decision to participate in this study. Moreover, you should remember that there is the federal law on data processing, on processing personal data. To be more precise, the law stipulates that if we process depersonalized data, in this case, the patient should give consent to storing this depersonalized data, and the patient should give consent to do it. All the issues related to how long this data should be stored, where this data should be stored, etc. Well, what's the procedure? Sometimes we do not know exactly when the doctor gets the permission of the patient to start collecting real world data. And when the doctor becomes a researcher, sometimes the doctor underestimates the situation when informed consent should be obtained from the patient. Also, there are specific limitations, although they are conditional, in order to have the full understanding that the patient realizes everything and gives his or her consent willingly. That's also important to understand. Also, as we said, there might be invasive and non-invasive procedures during the study. Sometimes additional procedures can occur. That's quite possible. But in this case, there should not be excession of the minimal load on the patient. In this case, the time is limited for such additional procedures. And of course, in this case, this is the study that should be conducted in accordance with the special protocol. Right now, we are working in the conditions of the COVID-19 pandemic, And of course, we pay attention to the drugs that entered the market much earlier than they were supposed to be. That's a faster track procedure of entering on the market. And of course, the ethics committee should do everything possible to guarantee the obtaining of high quality real world data in accordance with standard operating procedures. Also, issues related to patient counseling, blood collection. Well, all these issues should be written into the documentation. We know that we have a letter of the Ministry of Health, as well as there are European guidelines on the management of clinical trials aimed at maintaining high standards of clinical trials. On the one hand, that's a priority for all participants in the process. At the same time, they're aimed at using alternative monitoring methods, also establishing contacts with the patient at home, also minimizing risks impacting the study per se. And of course, here, I should say local ethics committees play a key role in saving this study in our non-standard conditions wherein now we should also talk about the necessity to make decisions quickly and with full responsibility, as it has been mentioned today. As for the marketing authorization holder, in case there are adverse or side effects of the particular drug. When there are such cases of adverse events, they should be reported according to the existing procedure to authoritative bodies. But we know that there is a shortage of time, especially right now in the situation of COVID 19, when doctors work in so called red zones, red areas. So this order of reporting of adverse events or side effects is not fully observed. So, of course, it's important to change the situation to make this reporting process much faster and easier. Another thing is the questions related to informing the patient about the COVID 19 diagnosis, the issue of whether the patient should be treated at home or in the hospital. Well, what to do if the patient presses the panic button, also how to protect the medical staff. Well, doctors, medical nurses must have personal protective equipment and know how to use it. Also, it is important for doctors, for medical nurses, so that they would not contract COVID 19 in this case. Also, how to provide the necessary conditions for a normal life of specialists who were sent to areas where there was an outbreak of the infection. The second question, which is also important, is the distribution of limited resources. We know that the government has made important steps to improve the situation, especially at the initial stage. We see that there are problems all over the world. That's not just a Russian problem, it's a dilemma. And of course, there should be the just distribution of resources according to clinical and medical ethics. Clinical ethics should protect the interests of a particular patient. What should a doctor do when it's impossible to provide assistance for everyone? Of course, there should be the change in clinical approaches right now. But if we look at the fact that at this period, and it's a critical one, when the question is who should survive when 100% survival is impossible. Way back in the 1970s in the West, the standards of clinical trials were developed, ethical standards and medical technologies such as organ transplantation, hemodialysis, etc., were developed. Of course, the first question which emerges right now is the question of resource distribution, and the International UNESCO Ethics Committee on Science and Technology raised this issue, the distribution of resources within the system of state health care. That's on the agenda of not just the governments of many states, but also on the agenda of the United Nations. The methods of distribution of resources on the micro and macro levels is justifiable if it is based on the principle of justice, equality, and well being. The major criteria should be the technical justification. That is why here we're talking about the issues of just distribution of resources. The processes must be transparent and respect human dignity. The first ethics committee was called the Divine because many principles we are talking right now, especially applicable to COVID-19, relates to the access to resources, and that was the first ethics committee dealing with artificial kidneys. When we're talking about a shortage of resources, Alexei Sergeyevich is one of the main specialists understanding this question. Here we're talking about pharmacoeconomics. As for health technologies, we should pay a lot of attention to this question. There are more and more drugs emerging on the market, and as for assessment of real world data, while we assess this data at the same time, we should know exactly the role of each particular drug, its place on the market, and there should be comparative studies conducted like dexamethasone and tocilizumab. We analyzed the evidence and as for the distribution of clinical outcomes when these two drugs were compared, when, for example, tocilizumab and dexamethasone were studied, and you can see different curves. They are different. We didn't take into account the cost of each drug, but if we involve specialists involved in cost effectiveness assessment, the situation will be even more complex. So here you can see the decision tree. Well, without the analysis, and this study will be also done to assess the severity outcomes of the issues, and of course, bringing to bear the cost of the drug, bringing to bear efficacy and safety. We can see vulnerable aspects related to modern drugs, but that means there is room for development, and that means we can develop recommendations for the use of such drugs. That's also important right now in the COVID 19 pandemic. Of course, there is a need to pull efforts in our work and to exercise discipline. We need to change the situation with the consideration of guidelines and documents. We should have SOPs. We should use modern communications facilities to conduct meetings to discuss all these issues. Also, drugs to treat the coronavirus should have access to the market as quickly as possible, and the ethics committee should be involved in this process. There might be different situations when people can get sick, when there might be lockdowns imposed. Sometimes, well, it's impossible to meet person to person. We need to use the online mode, including educational programs, Of course, as for the ethics committee, there should be professional physicians on the committee as well as staff members who do not have medical education. There is an educational program in the West for people who have medical education, and for those who do not have medical education will have to do similar work. We have already started developing educational programs with the support of the Association of Clinical Pharmacologists. We'll be able to identify our direction forward to upgrade the qualification of our members of local ethics committee. And in the conditions of the pandemic, we should focus first and foremost on quality, and especially if there is a lockdown, there is a need to develop standing operating procedures. There should be the possibility of cooperation between ethics committees when, for example, one committee can delegate powers to another committee because in this area there was a strict lockdown imposed. Other issues related to risk management, all these issues should be the focus of the work of local ethics committees. Right now, we can see that clinical practice changes in dynamics, especially as post marketing studies are concerned. Well, sometimes we plan the study for a year, for 2 years, but within the year, the situation can change. Well, guidelines can change due to the COVID-19 infection, and the Ministry of Health guidelines can also change, like they have changed within a half-year period. Of course, medicine is art, like poetry, like staging. And of course, these words are of great importance because of the situation that we are having today as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, issues of bioethics are being raised by many specialists. They are becoming more and more important. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you, Alexander. Colleagues, any questions for Alexander? Alexander, I'd like to ask you one short question. What's your view, Alexander? We have experience in conducting pre marketing studies, and as far as your experience is concerned, you've been on the ethics committee, you pay a lot of attention to research and development. Is it necessary to have a book like Good Clinical Practice or something like that? Thank you for this interesting question. Well, I remember you mentioned this in your presentation in 2019. There was an attempt like that to develop a standing operating procedures for good clinical practice. That's very important, but I should say that that's the area which is of great importance for us. Of course, whether real world data become good clinical practice, that's a philosophical question. Why is that so? We're trying to reach perfection during our life, but we must remember that it's impossible to reach perfection, to have an ideal. So in uh, RWD, we are aspiring after that, but in terms of good clinical practice, we have almost achieved our ideal. Everything depends on what distance we'll have to walk through. Everything depends on the medical community and on regulators, because as for good uh, clinical practice, we should work together with regulatory bodies. In this case, will be able to achieve our goal. Yes, it's important to think about book. It's possible to write it, and also as a result of this conference, and you can see there have been a lot of different questions raised, and Sergey was absolutely right, saying that right now the situation with COVID-19 is similar to that after World War II. And right now, we can see what dividends we can gain for future generations. If we manage to get these dividends, our ancestors will be very glad, very grateful for us. But it will be a very difficult path to walk. Thank you, colleagues. Ask questions in our chat. We'll collect all the questions and then we'll uh, send questions to Alexander. It's a great honor for me to give the floor to our foreign colleague.